In fact, this edition is the first one with the newer members, which include Saudi Arabia, Iran, Egypt, UAE, etc. Now, BRICS is also being seen primarily now as an anti-West bloc led by the likes of China and Russia. So what is a country like India doing in such a bloc, along with blocs like the SCO, which also India is part of? What are countries like Saudi Arabia and UAE? And remember, these countries are hell-bent against a country like Iran. This is perhaps the only grouping in the world where Saudi Arabia, UAE, and Iran are part of this newest set of members of BRICS. What are they doing together in such a grouping? What is it that binds the BRICS group of countries? All of these are questions that need to be asked. But there's also the interesting prelude to this meeting itself. The Prime Minister had a 1-hour-long bilateral meeting earlier today with the President of Russia. This is the second time he's met with President Putin just in the last 3 months. He is going to have, within the hour, a meeting with the new Iranian President, Mr. Pezeshkian. It's the first time that Prime Minister and the new Iranian President will be meeting. And tomorrow, most likely, and there is a lot of speculation about this, that there will be a meeting between Prime Minister Modi and President Xi Jinping of China. If it happens, it will be the first time in 5 years that the leaders of India and China have met. And like I said, the prelude to this meeting is the announcement yesterday that India and China have reached an arrangement for patrolling at the disputed and extremely hostile line of actual control, where hostilities have continued for the better part of the last 4 years. So the question then is, as India sees it, is BRICS a convenient boat to be on at a time when tensions are there between India and its traditional Western partners, whether it is Canada? Certainly that bilateral relationship has taken a nosedive. And even with the United States, with the opening of the charges against a former Indian intelligence official, are things not as rosy as they seem to be? But first, the story of what is happening in Kazan.
In BRICS as an important voice in the growing debate around the world on multipolarity, on the need for global governance reform.
रूस और यूक्रेन के बीच चल रहे संघर्ष के विषय पर हम लगातार संपर्क में रहे। जैसा मैंने पहले भी कहा है, हमारा मानना है कि समस्याओं का समाधान शांतिपूर्ण तरीके से ही होना चाहिए। शांति और स्थिरता की जल्द से जल्द बहाली का हम पूरी तरह समर्थन करते हैं।
All right, so is it a clear signal by the Modi government, not just to the grouping of BRICS members and the new adjunct members who've joined, but also possibly to some of its Western partners, America included? Ksenia Kondratieva is a senior Russian journalist. She'll be joining us in a moment. Andrew K.P. Leung is a China strategist joining us from Hong Kong. Professor Peter Kuznick, Professor of History and Director of Nuclear Studies at the Institute of at the American University. Lieutenant General retired S.L. Narasimhan is adjunct professor with the National Institute of Advanced Studies and served as the Indian Defence Attaché in China, also member of the National Security Advisory Board. And G. Parth Sarthi, former Indian High Commissioner to Pakistan, is also joining us. Professor Kuznick, let me start with you first. So earlier today, Prime Minister Modi met with Russian President Putin. Within this hour, he will be meeting with the Iranian President, the new Iranian President, Masoud Pezeshkian. And tomorrow, there is a lot of speculation, great likelihood that there will be a meeting between Prime Minister Modi and President Xi Jinping of China. How are these meetings being viewed in Washington, coming as they do at a time when, like I said in my opening intro, it's not exactly a bed of roses what we've seen transpire between India and the United States in the last few weeks, and certainly between India and Canada in the last few months?
Well, we have to look at the global picture right now. The IMF meeting is taking place at the same time, but we've got terrible tensions in 3 hotspots around the world. So the meeting is occurring at a very crucial moment The Middle East is ready to explode. The situation in Ukraine is going very badly for the Ukrainians, and the tensions in the South China Sea and around Taiwan are still quite palpable. So the fact that this meeting is taking place is not getting a lot of attention in the US media right now, but around the rest of the world, this is major news, and it has effectively eclipsed the IMF meeting, which is very, very unprecedented. So what's emerging is a global rebellion against the hegemony of the United States and the dollar. And we look at the position that the BRICS nations occupy. By the end of the decade, BRICS will dominate 37% of global GDP. Right now, the G7 has 30%, but by the end of the decade, that's going to go down to 28. And there are a lot of nations lining up to join BRICS at this point. So they now have 9 with the 4 new additions, but there are some 30 more who are knocking at the door. So this is posing the first real threat to U.S. global hegemony since the Cold War.
So let me ask General Narasimhan, if indeed this is the case, that it is posing a threat to U.S. global hegemony, and like I said at the top, the Prime Minister has met with the Russian President, he's meeting with the Iranian President, and tomorrow there will be likely a meeting with the Chinese President. And Russia, Iran, China are seen principally in Washington and in the European capitals as the ones who want to change the existing world order. They are the ones who want to upend what has been the established world order, certainly since the end of the Cold War. And India, which is seen as a partner by the Western countries, primarily the US, is sort of hobnobbing with these parties, whether it is BRICS, whether it is SCO, etc. The question that's being asked is, how can India have 2 legs in 2 different boats? You're also part of the Quad, which is primarily aimed at China, although no one will say it in as many words. But at the same time, you're also having one foot in a boat which is predominantly now a Russia-China-driven enterprise, which is BRICS.
Thank you very much for getting me on your program. Please look at this BRICS in the time frame aspect. BRICS was not started yesterday because of all these things were happening. BRICS came up quite some time ago, and then it came up with a particular agenda in mind, of economic agenda in mind. And of late, we have been seeing the multilateral systems have not been functioning really well. And therefore, you find these minilaterals and plurilaterals and multilaterals are coming up into play, so that people who can have a common understanding and a common desire to work on a program which everybody agrees, come together to do these kind of things. So if you look at it from one angle, it is something to do things for themselves in a better manner than what it was happening before. And in another way, if you see it, the Western way of looking at it is, okay, this is coming up as a different block, etc., etc. So my own understanding is that you must see it in this light, that the multilateral systems have not been really working well. The Bretton Woods financial institutions have their own issues. Therefore, you find institutions like I2U2, RIC, BRICS, SCO, all of them are coming up in some form or the other. So, just because a number of countries want to join BRICS, like for example, today the list went up to almost 40. This is being also seen as a different block that is coming up into play. But all 40 of them are not going to join BRICS overnight and come up members, etc. So you find you need to look at it from this angle, that it is coming up as an alternative to in the form of millilaterals, plurilaterals and multilaterals, and this is one of the multilaterals that is coming up into play.
So let me ask Ambassador Parthasarathy, the fact that this is happening, this meeting is happening just a day after India announced, and today it's been corroborated by China, that there is a thaw, there is a détente at the line of actual control. We're going back to the pre-2020 position. A patrolling arrangement has been arrived at between both countries. We don't know the details of it. We have some elements, but we don't know the bare bones details of it. The question then is, so this hostility being resolved as much as it has been yesterday after the announcement, that plus the meetings that the Prime Minister is having with the leaders of Russia, Iran, China, wouldn't this be seen as at least from a Western point of view, destabilizing? Is India also trying to send out a signal certainly to Ottawa, to Washington, that look, we have friends in many places, and if you think you can use some Khalistani elements to try and rattle us a bit, then we can sort of notch it up one or two steps too.
Well, let me say that the Khalistani episode is restricted to a genius who's the Prime Minister of Canada. Mercifully, nobody else is involved in that. But it's an old issue. After the Soviet Union collapse, we were seeing a world of Western hegemony. And it was very, very clear that the Western countries were first going to squeeze breaking up Soviet Union and also dominate the world currency-wise. It was for this reason we started the BRICS: Brazil, Russia, India, China, and Saudi Arabia. Now, the question is, where do we go from there?
Yeah.
The BRICS has worked well. It has its bank in South Africa, but it has not developed a clout politically, and therefore I think, and that it was more representative. As you were saying, large numbers are applying for representation, but the reality today, Zaka, is the American domination globally of the world economy. We are all at the mercy of the US dollar. We are therefore at the mercy of how the Americans move. And therefore, I think we already have got moving within BRICS, as I said, with the banking facilities in South Africa. But we do need a much greater economic integration. And what is being suggested by bringing in others, four members really, and Ethiopia, Egypt, and most Iran, and
Saudi Arabia and UAE, yeah, those are the newer members, yeah.
Yeah, and actually, if you ask me, the UAE is the friendliest country to India amongst the Gulf. It is the country with whom we have a huge economic setup of cooperation, including over 2 million Indians working there. So I think, to us, this is the beginning of expanding the bank setup earlier.
Okay.
You've got now the oil-rich countries also in. But I think we have to work much closer to develop the sort of bank which we can have.
So I'll come to that de-dollarization part in a second. Let me also ask Andrew Leung this.
The almighty dollar.
Andrew Leung, for 4 years, India and China were, having troops, 50,000 on either side, eyeball to eyeball confrontation. In Galwan, 20 Indian soldiers died, and India's contention is a far larger number of Chinese soldiers died as well. And we've had the first step of disengagement formally announced yesterday. Now, is India to forget all of what happened in the last 4 years and, go along merry with this multilateral arrangement of BRICS, where China and Russia clearly have oversized influence? India is also part of an SCO, which is primarily a China-driven arrangement. And again, this contradiction that India is part of the Quad, which willy-nilly, whether they say it or not, is meant for free and open Indo-Pacific. So the question that should be asked is, who is making the Indo-Pacific unfree? There is only one answer. There's only one country that is doing so. So, what binds BRICS? What is BRICS's glue that brings, for example, again, I bring that example to the forefront. Saudi Arabia and Iran are part of one grouping of nations. I can't think of any other group of nations other than perhaps the United Nations General Assembly that you have Saudi Arabia and Iran as part of the same platform.
Well, first of all, let's be real. The petroleum agreement doesn't mean that the border disputes between India and China are thereby resolved.
Oh, not at all.
Nor does it mean that, well, no, let me finish. Yeah. Nor does it mean that even the line of actual control will be clearly defined. It only means that in firm attempt to de-escalate, as already agreed by both leaders many months ago. So that's point number one. Point number two, I think what we're seeing here is a almost transformational dynamics of the global order, whereby, as pointed out earlier, the U.S. hegemony seems to be less effective, particularly with increasing doses of American unilateralism, imposing its will on many countries in the developing South, in the global South. And of course, as the global South is rising in this economic cloud, they're now rallying up to each other as a counterweight. But then the third point I like to make is that
But Mr. Liang, you say it's imposing U.S. hegemony. There are two wars going on right now. One in Russia, Ukraine, the other between Israel and Hamas. What can BRICS do to stop those two wars?
Well, I mean, the BRICS is not there to solve all problems. What I'm trying to say is that it represents a definite momentum of the global South to rally up each other as a counterweight against U.S. Hegemony. But the point I'm trying to make just now, before you interrupted me, was that the idea of blocks doesn't work anymore. Even though the countries are joining the BRICS, it doesn't mean that they want to form blocks. And even in Asia, if you ask all the Asian countries, in the Southeast Asian countries, although they are good friends with China, but they're also good friends with the United States and with India. So I think that we're seeing also a more nuanced relationship.
But by the way, none of the Southeast Asian countries are part of BRICS. I just want to underline that none of the Southeast Asian countries, nor Japan, nor South Korea. But be that as it may, I want to ask General Narasimhan. You know, I'm coming back to that fundamental moot point, which is that let's take a 30-year view. For India's rise, which is the one country that is most inimical to that rise? I think from evidence of the last 4 years, it's very clear that it is China. Now, the question is, can you find a new normal, a new modus vivendi to sort of exist with each other, because you can't keep going, having these hostilities. At the same time, to actually think that, we can be part of a China-led multilateral arrangement like BRICS or SCO, and at the same time also be part of Quad. I just think you're putting your legs in two different boats, and inevitably when you do that, you end up drowning. So the question is, how do you find that modus vivendi to coexist with China? Because after all, as Pranab Mukherjee famously said, in the context of Pakistan, that is, you can only choose your friends, not your neighbors. But that doesn't mean that you're part of all of these multilateral arrangements, which are frankly self-contradictory.
There are 2 points as answer to your question. The first point is that world is slowly moving towards a bipolar world over a period of time. Maybe it may take 30 years, 40 years, whatever time it takes. And in that particular period, you will find some kind of competition coming up even in this region. And that will play out between India and China. That is a given. Even if the boundary issue in some form gets stabilized, like Mr. Lung said, that it is not a full resolution. It is going to take a long time to do this. However, for the same strategic space when India and China are looking at, you will find some kind of competition coming up in this place. That is the point number one, that you cannot wish away. The second point is regarding this question about how to deal with both these groups having two legs on two boats. That is what strategic autonomy is all about. Wherever your interests are aligning with this group, you do support, you do form part of that particular group. And if your interests are lying in a particular issue with the other group, you do that. So that is what the strategic autonomy is all about. We take that decision based on our interests and our people's interests, and that is how we are able to manage both.
No, but General Narasimhan, at some point, aren't members of either group going to say, who is this joker in the pack who keeps jumping from one group to another? if you are saying that eventually we're going to move into two blocks like we saw through much of the Cold War, then India needs to make that choice. The question is, and I think it's a fairly easy choice, but the point is, how much elbow room does a country like India have to jump from the Quad box on one day to the BRICS box on the next day?
See, it is like this. If you are looking at two blocks and then India jumping between two, then that your argument becomes okay. But what I am trying to tell you is that wherever our interests are matching, we are going to take, and we are part of both the sides. We are not going to jumping from each one to other. We are going to look at issues and then go along with each of these groups. And that is where the strategic autonomy comes and plays about. And that is what we have been doing. If you look at our stance on Russia, Ukraine, look at our stance on Israel, Hamas, that is what we have been doing. And I don't think there has been a major pushback on this from both the sides.
Okay, so let me ask Professor Kuznick about this de-dollarization. Now, admittedly, one of the economic rationales, and there is some merit in this, for why the BRICS countries have come together, and now you have newer members like Saudi Arabia, UAE, Egypt, Iran, etc., is to try and reduce the dependence on the dollar. As of today, 89% of all global trade, all foreign trade, happens in the dollar. Now, do you see that changing in the foreseeable future? But more importantly, the G7 countries, as of today, the G7 countries account for about 30% of global GDP, about 29% of global GDP, about 30%, let's say, whereas the BRICS countries, which is the five primary BRICS countries, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, account for 27 trillion. If you add the newer countries, Saudi Arabia, Iran, Egypt, Ethiopia, etc., into it, and the UAE, that would be 30 trillion, slightly more than what is the current G7. The problem is the BRICS countries are growing at a much faster clip than the G7 countries are, and at some point in the near future, if not the foreseeable future, the BRICS countries will, as a bloc, be more valuable in terms of GDP compared to the G7 bloc.
Yeah, the trajectory is clearly in the direction that you're indicating. The global south is on the rise. Asia is really the driving force in terms of global development. Europe is in decline, and the U.S. has deep economic problems, $35 trillion indebtedness, and nobody knows what this election is going to bring. What if Trump does get reelected? What does that mean in terms of trade war? We know he's going to start a trade war with China, but the Europeans are also worried about the consequences of a Trump presidency and his fulsome embrace of tariffs. So I think that the world, I go back to something the London Economist said. They said that to Biden, this is a struggle between autocracy and democracy. To the rest of the world, it's a struggle between autocracy and hypocrisy. So they see the U.S. and they see the role that the U.S. is playing in sanctioning countries it doesn't like. So the dollar has become a tyranny to much of the world right now. And when they look at the United States' role in supporting Ukraine so aggressively, at the same time that they're not putting any restraints on Netanyahu,
Yeah.
I mean, the hypocrisy is so palpable and so infuriating. So I think that part of this is a statement about U.S. domination, U.S. hegemony over the past 75, 80 years. And people are looking for a new order.
No, I think Professor Kuznick's point is an absolutely valid one. I think people are raising very valid questions. On the one hand, America, gives us lectures to Mr. Putin about war and excesses of war and expansionism and so on. And then look at what Mr. Netanyahu is doing in Israel. There's simply no fetters around him. People are questioning Ambassador Parthasarathy. How is this not a case of blatant double standards?
I look at this purely in terms of my country's interests, India's interests. Now, we've had a record of being able to maintain relations successfully on both sides of the fence. Right now, We have a relationship with the US. We have a good relationship with the Russians. And yes, we do, let us be real, have serious, broader problems with China. But nevertheless, it would be foolish of us to ignore China's emerging role as a power, though that is now slowing down. So I think what we have done, and this I believe is wise, and this is not any one government, it has transcended elected governments in India. For God's sake, widen your options. Keep your options open. Never get too close and embracing any one party which can 5 years later dump you. And what we have done now is that we have an equally good relationship with the US and Russia. The Americans have not liked it, but they need us to balance China. So we have managed very well. And they may need us to balance China, but I will use that to bring China around. So we are playing a global, trilateral, multilateral game. And coming to the latest persons like the UAE, the UAE is our strongest partner across the in the Arabian Sea. Millions of Indians live there.
Yeah.
Billions of dollars come from there. And if you ask me, rather than talk of America and others, we look more closer to home, where UAE and other Gulf countries should be involved. And I think what we are doing is trying to make these organizations inclusive. And if we can't make the organizations inclusive, we have ourselves a foreign policy which is inclusive.
So let me ask Mr. Liang.
We're not going to change our relations
with
Israel. We're not going to change our relations with Israel.
I'm going to come to the concluding part now. Mr. Liang, I come to one more. If China has ambitions of changing the world order, and if Russia is sort of playing along because it suits Russia's interests of changing the world order, clearly India's interest is in the existing world order. Yes, India has issues with some parts of that, the Bretton Woods institutions, the reforms of the UN Security Council, etc. Those are issues. Notwithstanding that, the existing world order has been beneficial for India and for India's continued growth trajectory over the next 2, 3, 4, 5 decades. It is important that the world order is preserved as it is now. How do you fundamentally reframe that when Japan is not part of this arrangement, South Korea is not part of this arrangement, none of the ASEAN countries are part of this arrangement? Forget about, okay, you want to take a non-Western world view. Absolutely, go ahead and do it. And in Africa, other than South Africa, and now Ethiopia is a new member, no other member of Africa is part of this arrangement. Other than Brazil, no other member of Latin America is part of this arrangement. How is this arrangement going to be the dawn of a new world order?
Well, first of all, I don't think that China wants to change the world order, using your own word. China
it absolutely does. It absolutely does.
China wants to modify the world order. It doesn't want to change it. Because there are certain failings of the world order. Look at the globalization.
You are saying that China has no problem with a US-led world order?
Okay, well, I'm saying that China is trying to modify that. In fact, China is the largest beneficiary of the existing world order for a long, long time. But there are serious failings of the existing world order.
China wants a Chinese-led world order. It doesn't want an America-led world order. That's why we're having all of these fights in, the South China Sea and everything.
Let me respond to that.
Okay,
let me respond to that. I mean, if you keep on interrupting me, how can I respond?
Go ahead. I'm waiting for you to respond. Yeah.
Please allow me. Well, I think that China doesn't want to change the world. Don't want to modify that. But of course, China does not want to lead the world order. I don't think that China wants to lead it. And then that's the point. China wants to have a major contribution to modifying the world order. But of course, China's strength lies in the global connectivity. And China sits right at the top of the global supply value chain. And that's just the reality. And then, of course, China doesn't buy this rhetoric of autocracy versus democracy. Well, look at a lot of so-called democratic countries are faring and compare with the legitimacy of the Chinese government
By
in
the way,
terms of support
in
people.
in
That's
BRICS, and now in
what
this
it means. That's the point
extended
we will
group of
have to
members
get
of
it.
BRICS,
And
Russia is
gentlemen,
not a
trust
democracy.
and we can
China
stop
is not a
and
democracy.
send the balance.
Brazil, well, you know, they've had elections last year. India is a democracy. South Africa has also had elections last year. Look at the newer members. Saudi Arabia, not a democracy. Iran, not a democracy. Egypt, not a democracy. Ethiopia, not really a democracy. And neither is the United Arab Emirates. So let's not get into this whole democracy talk, because BRICS is not exactly a conglomeration of democracy. So that's what I go back to the point of, you know, what is it that binds these groups together? Frankly, I don't know what binds these groups together, other than they want to see a change of the existing world order. But be that as it may, I'm going to wrap up this discussion. We'll see how this story plays out. But like I said, the fact that the Indian Prime Minister has met the Russian President, the Iranian President, and will be meeting the Chinese President is very, very significant. It's going to be viewed with very great interest in Washington, in London, in all of the European capitals, certainly in Ottawa now, given the ongoing tensions between India and Canada. But I think it is India signaling that, yes, this is what we believe is strategic autonomy. It is also India showing the United States in particular that, look, we have leverage. You're not our only friends, down the street. We have other allies and other partners as well. So I think it's a bit of a, to use Gen Z language, it's a bit of a flex. But let's see if that actually results in material changes to how business is done. I want to now shift focus to a special interview that we've done because there are all eyes now on the US elections. It is as close as it can get between Kamala Harris and Donald Trump. The whole world wants to know, and I'm sure millions here in India want to know, who has the edge, who's likely to win on the 5th of November. This is an exclusive interview with CNN commentator and host of GPS on CNN, Fareed Zakaria. So we are exactly 2 weeks out from the US elections. It is the race to the White House, and it has not got this close in an entire generation, perhaps even beyond. Of course, the contest is between incumbent Vice President Kamala Harris, who is the top of the Democratic ticket, and former President Donald Trump, who is the Republican nominee. The question is, and this is what everybody wants to know, and frankly, we won't know till the 5th of November, who America has chosen as its next president. But let's try and make sense of why this has become so close and whether there are any clues in the close nature of this contest as to who it favors. Because the polling, and we've seen polling virtually every week coming out. The latest is a New York Times poll that has come out just in the last 24 hours, which seems to suggest that it is a dead heat with a slight edge to Harris. But in the way in which America chooses its next president, that might not mean much, because ultimately you need to win not the popular vote, you need to win what is called the Electoral College. You need to win about a handful of these battleground or swing states, and there it's pretty much a toss-up. Anyone, either one, could win that. Let's try and make sense of this by speaking to one of the foremost international affairs experts, author, and the host of GPS on CNN, Fareed Zakaria. Thank you very much for speaking with us here on CNN News 18.
My pleasure, Zaka.
Fareed, let's start off by asking you that simple question. Why is this contest so close? It's literally a knife's edge. Less than 1% separates Kamala Harris and Donald Trump. And at this point, 2 weeks out from the election, any of these possibilities can happen or come true on November 5th. Trump could win the White House, Harris could win the White House, and we could have a situation where Harris wins the popular vote but loses the White House.
It's a very good question, Zaka, and I think there are two answers to it. One is that for the last generation, for 25 years, the United States has had very close elections, very evenly split. If you remember, 25 years ago was the Bush-Gore election, 24 years ago. And that election was decided by 536 votes in Florida. Other than Obama's first victory, which was a landslide, every election really has been very close. So the country is divided about evenly and has been for a long time. And so this is in some sense one more reflection of that very divided country. I think the second answer to it is, and which is must be what a lot of people are thinking around the world, is how can Donald Trump be so close given all the complications, the two impeachments, what happened on January 6th of 2020. So the answer is, I think, there. Donald Trump has figured out a way to speak for a large group of people in the United States who feel kind of dispossessed by the current order. And these people tend to be more disproportionately non college educated, white, rural voters. Now, that's not the only part of Trump's base, but that is the core of his base, and that has stayed with him no matter what. And because they view him as, yes, he may be flawed as a character, but he fights for them, and that sense is remarkably strong and resilient. And in fact, the more Trump gets attacked, the more his base doubles down on him. That is the phenomenon which I think is new, and I have to be honest, is almost unique. I've rarely seen an American politician who has that loyal a base.
Let's talk about early voting, and they say that it's not necessarily connected to eventually how on voting day America tends to vote, but early voting generally tends to favor the Democrats. In 2020, you had historic numbers of early voters, largely driven by the COVID virus, which was very much active when the 2020 election happened. This time, I believe, in some states like Georgia, it is at record numbers. In some other states, you're seeing a significant fall from 2020. Would you read too much into that?
I wouldn't, Zaka, and everybody now, because the race is so tight, everyone is searching for clues. It's like astrology at this point. Everyone is trying to find something that can tell them something. You put it exactly right. The truth is 2020 was very unusual because of COVID. So large numbers of people voted. It was also very unusual because it kind of got wrapped up with partisan politics, with Democrats urging that people vote by mail-in, Republicans saying don't do it. This time around, the Republicans have stopped saying don't do it, even though Trump every now and then casts aspersions on the early voting or on the mail-in balloting. So it's sufficiently messy as a result that I suspect that, first of all, there won't be a very clear pattern that will vary state to state. And I think it's probably somewhat unpredictable. There are a lot of signs that actually this time the mail-in ballots may be roughly the same. Maybe, if you look at the people who are registered Republicans versus registered Democrats, they seem to be voting in some states in roughly equal numbers. All of which is to say, I think this is again what it's like reading the chicken entrails if you're an astrologer. I think best to just, I know it's very tempting to believe you have found some early sign. My own guess is we're going to have to wait till November 5th. And by the way, we may have to wait many days longer than November 5th. You said we won't know until November 5th. I think if we're lucky, we'll know on November 5th. This thing could go on for some days after the election.
I want to return to one of the points you made in the previous answer about how one of the most loyal constituencies that Trump has had is non-college educated white voters. And that, we saw the strength of that in 2016, some of it in 2020, and we're seeing that again in this election cycle. But two groups he's doing better than expected are blacks and Hispanic voters, particularly black men and Hispanic men. Is there any particular reason why that's the case? Particularly, these are two demographics where you would expect Harris to be really running up the numbers in the high 80s, maybe even in the 90s. How is Trump holding on better than he did in 2020, better than he did in 2016? In fact, I'm told that among African American voters, he has the best numbers for a Republican candidate since the Civil Rights Act was passed in 1964. And this is despite him saying immigrants are eating cats and dogs.
So I think you've touched on a very important thing. I think that what you're seeing in the United States is a very major realignment It's something I talk about in my recent book, The Age of Revolutions. In fact, that it's in some ways what it's all about, the kind of upending of politics around the world. Um, and what is happening in the United States is the old categories are fading. And the old categories were based on economic class. You know, how much money did you make? If you were rich, you voted Republican. If you were poor, you voted Democrat. Now it's all the working class that's voting Republican and the elite professional class that is voting Democrat. It used to be that if you were black and Hispanic, that was the defining feature of your political identity. What is happening now is the defining feature of people's political identity are their views on a whole series of social issues, abortion, gay rights, what is called the woke agenda. And on those issues, it turns out that a lot of Hispanic men and black men are actually quite conservative. You know, a lot of Hispanics, because they're Catholic, are against abortion. A lot of black men who are traditionally very religious are not particularly receptive to gay rights. So you're seeing that that people's political identities are shaped more by those features. So you may have a black man who is thinking about his political identity more from the point of view that he's a man than that he's black. Or you may have a black rich person or a small business owner who thinks about his political identity more because he's a business owner and wants a tax cut than because he's black. So the old categories are fading and new categories are coming into being.
And the other big sort of divide is right down gender lines. I mean, if the ABC News Ipsos poll says when it comes to women, they're voting 60-40 in favor of Harris, and men, it's the almost other way around. It's 57 in favor of Trump and 38 to Harris. So again, is that because abortion is a real big talking point in this campaign cycle, or is this, again, something, a new age divide that we're having to contend with in the American electorate?
I think this may be one of those new alignments. Gender may be one of the biggest ones on which people are splitting. You have the numbers exactly right. And I think you can see it in a way in which the rhetoric of the two parties, right? The rhetoric of the Democratic Party is so much around women's rights, women's bodies, women's opportunities. They have, after all, nominated a woman. And on the Republican side, there is much more of that, not just male, but traditional male. The emphasis on it. If you listen to Trump recently, he was going on and on about the golfer Arnold Palmer. And he kept talking about how he was all man. And of course, being Trump, he couldn't stop himself from being vulgar about it and talking about what Arnold Palmer looks like in the locker room when he's showering. But think about the Republican National Convention, where they had Hulk Hogan, this big wrestler, rip his shirt off. The symbolic message being sent is we are comfortable with very traditional men and male imagery and male symbolism, right? So that is turning out to be one of these new divides.
I do want to telescope, into what the America's choice come November 5th or November 30th or December 15th, whenever we get to know finally who they've chosen between Trump and Harris, what that might mean for the world. And of course, the two most pressing areas of concern are the two wars, Israel-Hamas, and now, should we say, Israel-Hezbollah, Israel-Iran potentially. And then there is, of course, Russia-Ukraine. Depending on whoever the next occupant of the White House is, how do you see these two wars concluding? I mean, everyone would want it to conclude, but how do you see the trajectory of both of these two wars?
I think there's no question that everything that Trump has said suggests that he would be less zealous in his support for Ukraine and more willing to cut a deal with Russia and with Putin. Whether that means that he'll get an end to the war is very difficult to tell, because I can tell you, having been to Ukraine, just a month and a half ago, they will continue to fight. For the Ukrainians, this is an existential issue about their national sovereignty, and so I don't know how that will work itself out. But I think it's fair to say that at some point there is going to be a negotiation. The question is, will Ukraine be in a position, will it have the support of the United States to negotiate from a position of strength? And I think that it's more likely to have that under Harris than under Trump. And I worry about what that will mean in terms of global norms, no rewarding of aggression, no rewarding of territory seized in conquest. On the Middle East, I actually think there won't be much difference, because ultimately what is driving the events in the Middle East is an Israeli government that has decided it is going to take a hard line and crack down on all violence directed against it, whether terrorist violence from Hamas, whether violence from Hezbollah, from the Houthis, from Iran eventually. And while the United States, I think people exaggerate the amount of control the US has, the United States can modulate some of that. The Israelis, for them, they view this in existential terms, particularly this right-wing government. So I don't think you're going to see much change between Harris versus Trump. The area where I do think internationally, of course, is the biggest issue for India is neither of these wars. It's what Trump does on global trade. If Trump does what he keeps saying he will do, and he says it almost every day, which is that he will put tariffs on every country, that is a seismic shift to the global trading system. And for a country like India that is betting that it is going to be able to grow at 6-7% a year, access to those global markets without tariffs is absolutely essential. So it could be a very big deal.
And one final question again with an India-specific focus, especially given what we've seen between India and Canada in the last few weeks, and also this case in a U.S. court involving these Khalistani elements. Again, would it make much of a difference who is the next occupant of the White House, whether it's Harris or whether it's Trump? Because the view here in India is if America can go out beyond seven shores and hunt down its enemies, then India should be allowed to do the same.
I don't think there'll be much difference. Broadly speaking, the United States has made a strategic decision over 4 administrations now to move closer to India. There's been a good amount of reciprocation on the Indian side. I think the obstacles that the United States finds in dealing with India are more around trade. India is still a very protectionist country. There are very high duties on lots of things. So it's very hard for India to really rise as a manufacturing superstar because there's so many tariffs. I mean, most stuff is not made in any one country. When we talk about the iPhone, for example, it's made in 14 Asian countries and assembled in China. And so in India, they've facilitated that with the iPhone by lowering the duties on the inputs to iPhones. But there are a lot of other kinds of things where India still has these high duties. So I think those are the issues that are going to be more difficult. On the Khalistan issue, I think most people look at it as a specific one-off, that the Indian government is pursuing this issue. I think that, broadly, if you view that India is overreacting on these issues, that there isn't very strong proof that these people have actually done terrorism. Remember what the U.S. went out and brought to justice Osama bin Laden, who had planned 9/11. I don't think that there is a similar connection one can see in these people. But that said, I don't think it'll be a major obstacle, partly because I think it'll fade over time.
All right. Fareed Zakaria, as always, a pleasure speaking with you. Thank you very much for joining us and putting your thoughts into perspective for our viewers. Thank you.
We want to shift our attention now to how the Indian airlines continue to grapple with a wave of bomb hoax threats for the 6th consecutive day today, disrupting flight schedules and causing a lot of inconvenience during this busy festive travel season. Today, 20 flights of Air India, Vistara, Indigo have received hoax calls over the last 24 hours. In fact, Civil Aviation Minister Ram Mohan Naidu has said that the ministry is looking at an amendment to the Suppression of Unlawful Acts Against Safety of Civil Aviation Act to enable law enforcement agencies to invoke this law against people who make these hoax bomb threats about aircrafts at the airport. Now, he also said that the ministry was in the process of amending the rules to put people who are caught for making these calls on the no-fly list. That big announcement came in from the Civil Aviation Minister yesterday. We listen in first up.
Since the first day when it has been happening, and this is a process that we follow every time. Whenever there is a bomb threat case happening, or if it is through a call, or if it is through social media, or if it is through some other means, we have a strict protocol that we follow. Because for us, like I said, safety and security is the foremost aspect, and this we follow through the international guidelines itself. We have had multiple meetings. In the last 1 week, I have chaired certain meetings with all the necessary stakeholders within the ministry, and from the ministry we have thought of some legislative action also if it is required, which direction should be moved in. And we have come to the conclusion that there are two areas that we can explore. One.
All right, let's quickly go across to our guest joining us this afternoon. This is aviation expert Sanjay Lazar joining us on the broadcast. Mr. Sanjay, appreciate you taking out your time. Thank you for speaking to us here on CNN News 18. Mr. Sanjay, if you can put in perspective, all that you've heard and seen so far. Over 70 plus flights have received these hoax bomb threats in just the last 2 weeks. That's become a daily affair and causing a lot of nuisance, not just to the passengers. Of course, they're at the receiving end of a lot of inconvenience, delay, so on and so forth. Makes it worse in an emergency situation. But also for the airlines, the operational costs also keep getting added up. So tell us a little bit about what you make of this entire menace that keeps coming to the fore on a daily basis now.
Thank you, Christian. Thank you for having me on your show. It's the 7th day, if I'm not mistaken, and to my count, I think we've already crossed 100. I maybe give or take a couple here. If you're saying we've had more than 20 today, it's highlighted a lot of things. Right from day one, a week ago, I've been on various media, and whether it's social media or writing or speaking on TV, that I think we've lacked a proactive response. The Ministry of Home Affairs should have been involved instantly. We kept dibbling-dabbling, and then, of course, we, got lost. We said first it was pranksters, then we said, maybe somebody from inside. Now we find that they're being spoofed, and the VPNs are coming from Germany and the UK. This is something more serious. This is a very concerted effort to undermine India, its security, and make a fool of our cyber security premises, our aviation security. I do believe that given the multiplicity of agencies, and this is what I've said consistently over a week, you've got the Ministry of Home Affairs, you've got the Ministry of External Affairs involved, you've got the DIT, you've got the MOCA, that's the civil aviation, you've got the DGCA, the BCAS, the CISF, a number of we should have had a national federal agency like CBI or NIA or NSA, so looking into this, or IB or RAW, under the Ministry of Home Affairs, and we should have had a team, or the military intelligence. Any one of these agencies would have worked concertedly. Now, I think they're getting their act together and trying to do it. I believe BCAS DG had a meeting yesterday or the day before yesterday with all the CEOs, but I believe it's still short. We need to bring in all these social media companies, bring them on and make them cooperate with us. I think a lot of steps need to be taken. The minister wants to change the law and tweak the law, I understand. But as per my, knowledge, there are adequate laws to deal with the punishments. I, for one, am not in favor of this flight ban and no-fly list. I think put them in jail. No-fly is a given, no-fly for life. Not 5 years, 2 years, 1 year. But I believe jail and,
But they're also mulling at, life imprisonment through this kind of a legislative action. So that's what you're also reiterating in a sense.
Well, actually, Christy, what I'd like to tell you is Section 3 of the Suppression of Unlawful Acts Against Aircraft 1982 prescribes life imprisonment already. Section 3 says anyone who makes a threat to an airport or an aircraft has to be put in jail for life. So that, that's what they should have looked at. The only difficulty here is they cannot identify whom to put in jail or whom to charge, for which you need, this is a cyber attack. Let's not, kid anybody.
right, we're down to the home stretch in the US presidential elections, the race to the White House between Donald Trump, the Republican ticket, and Kamala Harris, the Democratic ticket. And it is going right down to the wire. 2 weeks, exactly 2 weeks to the polls. Who stands where? Let's take a look at the average of the Real Clear Politics poll that has just come out. This is as of 20th October 2024. And the gap is absolutely at a hair's breadth. Less than 1% separates Kamala Harris and Donald Trump. Kamala Harris at 49.2% and Donald Trump at 48.3%. Like I said, this is less than 1%. It's the closest that the average of the Real Clear polling has been in the last couple of months since Harris's candidature was formally announced at the Democratic Convention. So this is literally on a knife's edge. This could go either way. Just to put that into perspective, the margin of error in most polls in the US is plus or minus 3%. In this case, it is less than 1%, so it could go either way. It could be a Harris presidency or it could be a Trump presidency. But more importantly, it could also be Harris winning the popular vote but losing the Electoral College. The problem for Harris is that her gap, her lead has actually been narrowing.
He has no plan for how he would address the needs of the American people. He is only focused on himself.
Now worked for 15 minutes more than Kamala. Okay, she never worked here.
So Trump is closing on the gap, but he's not crossed Kamala Harris yet. And yet, today, 2 weeks out from the polls, why is that bad news for Harris and good news for Trump? Because relatively speaking, if you were to look at Harris where she is right now on the 20th of October, 2 weeks out from the polls, you compare that to the previous three Democratic candidates, all the way from Barack Obama in 2012, on the last or the penultimate week, 2 weeks leading up to the last 2 weeks leading up to the vote, Barack Obama was leading by 2.5 percentage points against Mitt Romney, who was the Republican nominee that year. Hillary Clinton, in the very first year that Donald Trump ran in 2016, she had a lead of 6.5 points. 6.5 points in the third week of October, leading up to the election in the first week of November, and yet Hillary Clinton lost the election. You know why she lost the election? She won the popular vote. She won by plus 3% in the popular vote, but the Electoral College she lost. She lost the critical battleground states of Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, despite having a 6.5% lead in the third week of October. Joe Biden, on the other hand, in the 2020 election, his lead was even bigger. He had an 8.5 point lead to Donald Trump in 2020, and that translated, when he had such a massive lead of 8.6%, that translated into a big Electoral College win. In fact, Biden got more than 300 Electoral College votes. He won the critical battleground states of Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania. Now, this is why this is worrying for Kamala Harris. She is polling far less than three of her Democratic predecessors in the past three election cycles. She is leading by under 1%, which means if Hillary Clinton at 6.5% could not win the Electoral College, then there is a huge question mark on whether at 0.9%, less than 1%, Kamala Harris can win the Electoral College. Now, this is one part of the problem. The other part of the problem is that Trump's own favorability, net favorability ratings as they call it, that has actually improved. Remember, in 2016, the first time he fought the election, he had a net unfavorability of minus 27 points. He's been slowly working on that. He's been improving that. In 2020, he almost managed to halve that. From minus 27, it came down to minus 12 points. And in this election cycle, this is his third election running for president, the top job in America. In the 2024 election cycle, his net unfavorability has come down to minus 9. So from minus 27, he's cut it down to a third in the last 8 years. So his net unfavorability is just minus 9, which means Kamala Harris has a tougher job. She's taking on a slightly more popular Trump than he was in 2020 and certainly than what he was in 2016.
Viewers, you're watching The Hard Facts, the most credible show at prime time. And let me tell you that the biggest story with global implications is unfolding even as we speak in Kazan, Russia. This is a massive story, viewers, and it deserves to be center stage at 9 p.m. on the most watched channel, on the most watched show, viewers. there are several messages being beamed out of the Kazan chapter of the BRICS Summit, where Russian President Vladimir Putin has pulled out all the stops to host world leaders from a growing list of more than 20 nations. You can see those pictures. The first among these is that a new non-West